Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. This is going to be a session on how journalists use open data. This was organized by Molly Boigon at the Forward, and she invited Katie and I to speak as well. Unfortunately, Molly can't be here this afternoon, but she sent us a recorded presentation, so we'll go ahead and play that. Thanks again for being here, and I guess I'll just kick it off with Molly's presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Molly Boigon. I'm an investigative reporter at The Forward. Thank you so much for joining our session about how journalists use open data. I'm going to run through a story that I did in the fall of 2019 that I think is a great example of the many ways that I use open data in my day-to-day life as a reporter. I'm going to share my screen. This story started when I went to a Community Board 12 meeting in Borough Park at the Amico Senior Center. Borough Park is a neighborhood that's of great interest to The Forward because there are a large number of Haredi Jews who occupy the neighborhood, ultra-Orthodox Jews. So since we cover the Jewish community, there's a lot that happens in Borough Park that's of interest to our readers. So I went to the community board meeting. There were a number of public commenters who were very upset about what they described as an increase in garbage on the street and the negative things that came with that, including the smell. They described rats, they described an increased blight on the neighborhood, and people were very upset. It was a very contentious meeting, very long. And at one point, one of the community board members tried to explain what was going on with the trash. And he said that because the city was rolling out a compost collection program, it had reduced the number of trash pickup days, and that the main problem with that was that there are so many schools, private Jewish schools, yeshivas in Borough Park that have a large number of children in them that were having their trash pickup reduced from 5 days a week to 2 days a week. So I decided to take a walk after the meeting and check this out, and I found a literal mountain of trash outside of one of the yeshivas in Borough Park. And there was, the problem was as described. There was a lot of trash on the street and it was just kind of a mess. So I decided that this would be of interest to our readers because it taps into, or I would later learn it taps into some of the interesting characteristics of Borough Park as a neighborhood. So my questions were, why was this such a problem in Borough Park? How much trash was there? What was the actual increase like? Trying to quantify this issue of the yeshivas and the enrollment at the yeshivas, and what other unique characteristics of the neighborhood might be affecting the trash pickup issue. And so District Manager Barry Spitzer said at the meeting, we have buildings with thousands of children within them, schools that serve breakfast, lunch, and dinner, who are getting twice a week pickup. And that was sort of my first clue into where to start the reporting. I took a look first at the Department of Sanitation's annual report for fiscal year 2019. The department breaks down the different trash categories by community district. So you have organic tons, which is compost, metal, glass, and plastic, recycling, paper recycling, refuse, which is trash. And as you can see, I circled Community District 12 in Brooklyn, and it's among the highest in the borough. Most of the districts there have refuse tons in the hundreds, and Borough Park and some other districts have refuse tons in the 200s. That was where I began. So it was true that the neighborhood generally had a high amount of trash. And then I took a look at the open data portal and discovered that the Department of Sanitation also keeps monthly tonnage data for trash collection. I went to the open data portal, to the visualization tool, and I put on a number of filters. Number one was I just wanted to look at Community District 12 in Brooklyn, and I just wanted to look at the year of 2019 to see if there had been an increase. The compost collection program started in September of 2019, and as you can see, October had the highest amount of refuse tons collected that year. So the people in the community board meeting were onto something. There was more trash collected during the month of October. Then I decided to look into the issue of the schools. I knew already that Haredi Jews typically don't send their children to public schools, so private school enrollment in Haredi neighborhoods like Borough Park, Williamsburg, Crown Heights are typically very high. The New York State Education Department keeps data of enrollment in non-public schools by grade. So I did some filtering and sorting, and it turned out that a number of the largest non-public schools by enrollment in the city are in Borough Park, including United Talmudical Academy at Borough Park. Again, the conversation and the community board checked out. I started to do some reporting on this and some issues emerged. One of them was that one of the trash pickup days was Saturday, which is the Jewish Sabbath, Shabbat. And so school staff who were Shabbat observant were not cleaning up after the trash collection on Saturday. So that was sort of contributing to some of the smell and some of the sort of vermin problems that people were seeing on the street. And another thing that came up from that is that, you know, a number of school staff at yeshivas are Haredi Jews, and in Borough Park in particular, many people speak Yiddish at home. So I looked at the Population Fact Finder, which is a great tool that incorporates American Community Survey data estimates. It turns out that more than 35,000 homes in Borough Park speak Yiddish primarily. And so I asked the city if they had done outreach to people who were sorting trash from compost in Yiddish, and the answer to that question was no. They said that they had done outreach in Spanish. So this was also one of the issues that I raised in my report, was the outreach in the right language to suit the community. And that was also, you know, I later spoke to Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, and that was one of the questions that he had too, about whether the city's compost program was being targeted to each neighborhood in the individual way that might have made it more effective. So the final result of the story was this story about the trash pickup on Shabbat and some of the other issues that came up, the enrollment of the private schools, Yiddish outreach issue. And, you know, this was a story that arose from sort of shoe leather reporting, going to a community board meeting, but that was ultimately carried along and supported and sort of flushed out using public data and open data. So again, just, you know, one example of the many ways that I use open data in my reporting, and I'm going to pass it off to the other reporters to walk through some of their stories that they've used open data for.
Okay, so if you're just joining us, that was a recording from Molly Boigon from The Forward. I think that's just a really cool story about phenomenon that you see and then being able to explain it with data that's available to you locally and sort of getting all the factors behind it. And that's a real great example of, I think, what we try to do as reporters. So my name is Welch. I'm an interactives and graphics producer at the city. We're a local newsroom that started up in 2019. We've got about 23 full-time staffers, and our focus is New York City. We have reporters in each borough, reporters who focus on specific beats like transportation, the criminal justice system, juvenile justice, and all sorts of things. So our coverage really runs the gamut, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we use open data in our reporting. So as a visuals producer, my work is really about distilling the data that's available into a visual narrative that goes along with our storytelling. Our data team is really me and our data reporter, Ann Choi, who does a lot of mining of different things and investigations. But really the entire staff is very data literate and uses data throughout their work. And that's one of the really cool things about working at the city, is that level of data literacy. It comes in all different forms. I know folks are looking at like police records, real estate data, health data, especially during COVID-19, transit data from the MTA and bridges and tunnels. There's just so much to look at that feeds into the stuff that we're reporting on. And so I'd say data is just integral to sort of everything we do. We pull from a lot of different sources to do that. A lot of stuff comes from our requests to city agencies. That could come in the form of FOIL requests. We did a story that had HPD data about housing lottery entries, and so that's something we requested directly from them. We've done stories on citizen complaints about police, and that's data that we've requested from CCRB with some other news organizations. And then there's state and federal data like Census Bureau data. We get data from private organizations and nonprofits to talk about specific things like homelessness. The Coalition for the Homeless has a great data set there. So there's all sorts of places, really. We do our own original data collection for some things, but New York City Open Data is certainly a really integral part of all that, because it's data that's coming directly from city agencies. One of the most valuable things about it is that it's updated fairly frequently depending on the data set. So something like Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings data, cases about violations of city code and administrative code, that data is updated very frequently. I think it's daily. Having access to that sort of thing on a frequent basis and just being able to go in and check it is really great for a lot of the stories we're doing, where there's just one thing maybe that we need to check real quick, or there's a pattern that is revealed in the granular data that we can dig into. And so having access to that without needing to submit a FOIL request and wait however many weeks or months that might take is a really valuable thing. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the open data that we've used in our storytelling. Most recently, it's been COVID-19 data from the Department of Health. They've released that data on the fly, some data from the mayor's office as well. And it's been a real process trying to understand that as it comes out and integrate it into our reporting. Transit data, like I mentioned, is something we use all the time. At the very beginning of the pandemic, we did some work comparing turnstile entries across MTA subway stations to see where people were traveling less and to sort of chart the massive drop in ridership as the pandemic began. I believe it was something like a 90% drop in ridership in March at the beginning of the pandemic. And we've used that throughout. We do a lot of maps. And so the geographic data that's on the open data portal is very important to us. 311 service requests are one of the big sort of sexy data set on the open data portal that has a lot of really great information that tells you a lot about how citizens are interacting with the government, what people are asking for help with, how the city is responding. We did some stuff with EMS response data to learn about how ambulances are responding, where they're going, and if that number has gone up or down of ambulance calls, which again has been something that's been useful to do during the pandemic. The thing that I want to focus on are some stories that we've done with the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings data. And this is data about, again, violations of city code, or building violations, that sort of thing. The part that interests me about this data is that so many stories end up pulling from this that we've done, at least on the open data portal. There have been 4 stories that I'm going to talk about just in the past year. We've been able to pull something from this data. And I think it gets at the other side of that interaction of people and government. One side is that the 311 requests where people are maybe noticing an accumulation of trash or an issue with a sidewalk or something like that. And this violation data, these quality of life complaints, are how the government holds people responsible for those things. Who is the person who's not shoveling the sidewalk, that sort of thing. And it's really fascinating stuff at the sort of case by case micro level. There's this great piece from the New York Times about the offices where people go in for these hearings and speak with an administrative judge who's going to adjudicate this case. And it's just regular people who, may not have any large scale responsibility, or maybe they're a building owner or what have you, but it plays at a really granular level. It's this entire part of how rules and laws are enforced in New York City that's not NYPD or the criminal justice system. It's an administrative justice system. So some of the stories that we've done about that are alternate side parking, which was initially suspended at the beginning of the pandemic, when there was sort of an expectation that you weren't going to be going outside for any reason, or for the most part, unless you really needed to. Everyone was going to be quarantining in their own homes. And so it would be a burden to have to move your car. And when those restrictions went away and cases started going up in October, the state instituted their red zones in different areas of the city, one in southern Brooklyn. And at that time, alternate side parking was not suspended again. And so we took a look at open data about parking violations, tried to see if we could identify if there was more enforcement or less enforcement in southern Brooklyn. And what we found is that there was slightly more enforcement compared to the same period as last year. So it was a 2-week period in October. There were about 1,300 violations, and there had been 1,200 last year during the same period. So this was a case where we wanted to see what was happening, how something was being enforced. And we saw that there really was no on the ground change in how things were being handled. Another story similar to this was one where we took a look at street vendors and enforcement of rules as a street vendor. In June, Mayor Bill de Blasio said that the NYPD is going to sort of phase out doing enforcement of street vendors as an effort to reduce interactions with the police and the public that weren't strictly necessary, that were causing friction, especially with a majority minority community of street vendors, and that will be better left to the Department of Health and the other agencies that regulate rules around street vending. In September, the NYPD had posted on social media about issuing 2 tickets essentially to street vendors, flying in the face of this announcement. And we wanted to see, had this change actually happened, had things shifted from NYPD to other agencies in enforcing street vending. And what we found when we looked at the oath data is that a lot of this enforcement had stopped immediately when the pandemic began. There was an incredibly sharp drop in tickets being issued in March. And so I think we only found about 17 tickets that had been issued since March for street vending. So it wasn't that any shift in enforcement had actually occurred, it was that there wasn't really any enforcement. And so we were able to see that these 2 tickets issued were really an exception. It wasn't as if NYPD was continuing to do enforcement. Most of that enforcement had already stopped. that was a way that we could sort of reality check and see, is this anecdote something that bears out and is a pattern, or is it just an isolated incident? One of the first stories I did when I started at the city was taking a look at unsafe building facades. In December 2019, Erica Tishman was killed by some falling debris in Midtown Manhattan from a building that had a chunk basically fall off. And this has happened before in the city, and there's an enforcement program that the Department of Buildings is responsible for that is supposed to inspect facades and make sure that they are safe. And it's a cycle, that 5-year cycle, and building owners of buildings taller than 6 stories, I believe, have a responsibility to make sure that they hire an inspector. If their building is unsafe, that they put up a sidewalk shed. And so when I joined the city before this had happened, we were already looking into sidewalk sheds as a nuisance and as a stopgap measure, that where building owners were not actually making the repairs and were just throwing up a sidewalk shed instead. And so this really motivated us to dig back into that and use a variety of data sources, one of which was a Department of Buildings Environmental Control Board violations, which are adjudicated by oath, and to look at buildings that had violations for being unsafe and creating immediately hazardous, unsafe conditions. And we were able to cross-reference that with this 5-year reporting program and see buildings that had already been identified as unsafe and still hadn't been fixed. And we found on average that these reports, when there was a report of an unsafe facade, you're required to make a change within 90 days, essentially. But there's a process of extensions and of penalties if you don't do things. Ultimately, we found that it takes about 500 days for an unsafe condition to actually be certified as being corrected. And so we identified these buildings that had these issues and actually went to them and saw if they had sidewalk sheds or not, and found a lot of situations where there were unsafe buildings that didn't have sidewalk sheds, just a system that is very slow to actually enforce fixing unsafe conditions. The Department of Buildings actually dedicated to doubling its staff to do this enforcement. So they've stepped up their enforcement effort since this tragic death. But there's just a surprising amount of data that you can use to triangulate through these violations where building owners are not being responsible and creating unsafe conditions. And so the last story I want to talk about is, I think, something that came together in like a day or two. It was very quick, at least from the data side of things. We wanted to see, with the eviction moratorium protecting people from being evicted during a pandemic, they have a place to quarantine and be safe and not have to deal with housing instability. One exception to that is vacate orders for illegal apartments. We found that there's a data set on Open Data that is just these repair and vacate orders. Checking to see if those have been in effect during the pandemic was very quick. We filtered the date range and we filtered the type of violation that we were looking for. And immediately we found these 100 cases, which we mapped out and wrote about some of the efforts to make these apartments sustainable and legal when it's necessary. There have been several pilot programs around that. Again, this was just a very simple, quick, effective use of open data that is sort of characteristic of how we approach reporting when we have a data question like this that we can answer very easily through an open data portal data set. I'll just finish by saying that we do a lot of different kinds of data projects. We have our COVID-19 tracker, which you can get to from our homepage on our website. Another large project that we're doing is a collection of obituary and death information from families of people who've had loved ones pass from COVID-19. So we're doing an effort to collect as much of that data as possible and write as many obits as we can. One of my colleagues from the city will be speaking about that tomorrow. If you're interested in that work, that's another great one to check out. And that's going to be it for me. And I'll turn it over to Katie.
Thanks so much, Will. And thank you for all the great work that the city does. I think your team probably does, in my opinion, some of the best work around data, and from COVID to everything else. Props to you all. So my name is Katie Honan. I am the City Hall reporter for the Wall Street Journal's Greater New York section. I'm not really a data whiz, although I do like various data sites. And this slide and the story I'm going to talk about, I got help from someone at the Journal who's a dedicated data reporter. The story I'm going to talk about is something that I got through One Data. What I found interesting about it is I saw a problem, and it was sort of what I was surprised to see in the data that actually got me to what I think is a more interesting story. So I'll start. That was the mayor around this time last year did a press conference at a 301 at the call center to talk about COVID. This is before we realized we should be wearing masks, but that's where that's from. So last summer, probably even in the spring, as a lot of people may have noticed, I heard people saying that there was more graffiti, and I also noticed that there was more graffiti. I don't particularly mind graffiti. It's just something that I'm used to, but it was on a lot of storefronts, it was on grates, it was on buildings. And it had become, to me at least, very noticeable. I did know that in April of last year, the city had cut its graffiti cleanup program to save money. This was through the Economic Development Corporation. That was just one of the ways the city needed to cut funds as it was really starting to struggle financially because of COVID. So I knew that, but I also figured, and this is just some data on how effective this program was. You can see just how many more sites were cleaned in fiscal year 2019 compared to 2017. But knowing this, I just assumed, to me, 311, as Will sort of mentioned earlier, it's where I go to kind of get a sense of the city. That's where to check the city's temperature, because we all know New Yorkers like to complain, and a lot of times it's warranted, and that's who they go to complain. They call 311, or they text, or they use the online portal for 311. So I just immediately thought the graffiti complaints on 311 must be out of control, or there must be a huge spike similar to what we'd seen. We'd done something similar looking at fireworks complaints, because as we all know, last summer, there were so many fireworks. I asked our data reporter, his name is Coulter, to crunch the data. And this is not an accurate visual of him crunching the data. This is just, I'm not a visual person like Will, so this was my version of a slideshow. And what he came up with the data actually surprised me. There wasn't a spike at all. In fact, they were down. This is from the email he had sent me, which really surprised me. He was like, look, there's not an increase at all. Maybe this isn't a story. The data isn't showing my hypothesis of what I thought there was. I knew that there was more graffiti. I was around the city a lot. I'd seen it all over. This was some of the data to show these were the weekly average complaints. This is by borough. And you can see it went down significantly last spring, except for like some spike in April. And then this is just citywide. So it had gone down. I just knew, look, I'm not the only one who's seeing this. I'm not the only one maybe just not even bothered by it, but I'd spoken to business owners who were like, look, we don't like all this graffiti on our storefront. We're trying to keep things clean. So I did more digging. And then finally, after speaking to people, I just called your 311 myself. And I asked to make a graffiti complaint. But my phone doesn't look like that, but that was just what I wanted to add for some color. And the 311 operator told me that they actually could no longer take any graffiti complaints because the city had cut that graffiti cleanup program the previous April. The only exception is they could take some complaints that could be forwarded to the NYPD if it was gang graffiti, gang tagging, which can be seen for investigations, hateful graffiti that is a threat or anything like that. Those get referred to the NYPD. But the EDC's graffiti cleanup program, the way it works as a business, would call up, get added to a list. Sometimes there's a backlog when you get cleaned up, but then you sign up for this forever graffiti cleanup program that basically you're checked off for life and they could send people in. Since that was no longer around, 311 no longer took the complaints. And actually then I thought that was, this is me writing, not accurate as well, but I actually thought that was a more interesting story because the whole point of 311 is to get complaints and register these complaints in real time as they come in. But because the city was no longer allowing them, it did not give an accurate picture. We don't know how many people were calling up to make complaints and being turned away. We don't know what that is. And I felt that actually it took away the whole point of 311, which is to become this depository for people to register their complaints. And then the city could get an idea of what's needed. Because we also know if in this next budget, if someone proposes, let's bring the graffiti cleanup program back, someone could say, well, the 311 calls are down. We don't need it. So this is the story that I came up with. The city confirmed that they had indefinitely ended the graffiti cleanup program and that they did stop registering complaints, except for those that would be referred to the NYPD. And this just gives you a sense of how many complaints. In December of 2019, there were 4,300 complaints. January of 2020, over 2,000 complaints. And in July, just 289. And of course, those are ones that maybe they snuck through or they were ones that would be referred to by the NYPD. Now, as a follow-up, last week, the NYPD introduced their own graffiti cleanup program. It's sort of a cops and community type of program to fill that gap. In the absence of this program, you have city council members funding programs like Wildcat that do actually clean up. But without the 301 data, we don't really know how it is. So that is what I came up with. Again, I found that very interesting because 311, if they're not taking the complaints for whatever reason, I thought that was actually more damning than just actually canceling the program and just saying, we'll hold on to it until later. Again, I found that a very kind of interesting way to look at the information we have. I mean, just going off of what Will spoke earlier, some other websites that I use. I love ACRIS, which is the Department of Finance, property records, mortgages, all that kind of stuff. The city's open data, like the amount of data that's available, it can be overwhelming in terms of what we could look at and stuff. And then, of course, the Department of Health data that we've been using for COVID has been criticized by many reporters, including myself, at the start of COVID for not putting up enough data to begin with. But I think since then, they've really improved it. That's it. I'd love to hear people's questions. I don't know the format we want to do this on. I'm happy to ask any questions about anything. I'm sure Will is as well. I'll also shout out the Campaign Finance Board's data. I see Steve Romaluski was on the, I don't know if he still is, but the information on the CFB website is amazing. I'm sure by the June 22nd primary, we'll know exactly where each supporter who gives money lives. That's how great those maps are.
Okay, so we have a question from Tim Martin. Are there risks in publishing the results of city data analysis without fully understanding the business logic or input from the agency itself? I'll start off by saying a big part of what we do with looking at any data set is trying to understand exactly what the inputs are and why the data looks the way it does. Particularly with COVID data, with health data, that's been really important to understand when we talk about how many tests are there or how many cases are there. Are we talking about one person getting multiple tests and that counting only once in a single day? Or are we talking about one person, one test, that sort of thing? That's a specific example, but it applies everywhere, particularly around the facade inspections, understanding exactly how that program works and talking with the Department of Buildings and understanding their process behind that. That's not a step that you can skip in trying to understand how the program works and trying to report on it. Katie, have you had any experience with that?
I mean, beyond just the business logic or input, I think the context of the data is always really important. And we've seen this in the vaccination data, neighborhood level vaccinations, looking at which zip codes have the highest vaccination rates. It had been reported by the city. I had reported this as well, but the 11697 zip code, which is Breezy Point in Queens, predominantly white neighborhood. It's also very small. And they had one of the highest vaccination rates. And then you also realize, well, they have a larger share of those people who are in the 1A vaccination, right? And they have more older people. It's not exactly a NORC, but there is a large population of older people. So putting that context as well. So it's not just look at this place getting all the vaccines, but understanding when you say cops and firefighters and teachers and older people should be the first people to get it. Obviously a neighborhood that has a larger percentage that already is smaller to begin with. I think City Island was up there as well. And it's the same kind of story, although it's not as white. But I think adding that context is always really important. And it's been a challenge looking at the COVID data of figuring out the death rate, looking at the raw numbers, figuring out, because a lot of the rates were skewed because a zip code might have a smaller percentage of people than somewhere else. So yeah.
I have a question for you, Will, of how you came to be a data reporter.
Oh, sure. I've been doing a mix of computer science and journalism as long as I've been doing this. In like high school, my job at the high school paper was to run the website. So throughout college, I had also done this combination of things. And so it started out, I did a lot of web development to begin with, but those coding skills sort of lended itself to data analysis as well. And so when I started doing reporting, it was sort of very natural to start taking a look at what are these data sets and how can I manipulate them in a way that's going to reveal some insights. So I think that's maybe different from a lot of reporters who come into it with, I have a question that I want to ask, what are the tools I need to learn so I can answer this question? I sort of came around it from the opposite end, but I think both approaches are equally valid way to get to that point.
I see we have another question, but I think Zachary could probably answer this better. It's from Lorraine, that open data would pertain to more than New York City. New York City's open data is renowned around the world. And pre-COVID, I'm not making this up, Zachary confirmed this, people would visit New York City just to speak to the mayor's office of data analytics and talk to them about their processes and what they have. So not that I'm doing PR for you guys, but I just thought that was worth noting that it is a world-renowned open data program.
Thanks for the shout out, Katie. Yeah, Lorraine, there is a data.gov, which actually contains data from all sorts of municipalities, federal, state, city from around the country, including ours. So our data gets sort of sucked up into data.gov, and you can find our data there along with many others. And then beyond nationally, we actually had an event earlier today talking about open data in Europe and the different open data portals that exist there. There's an EU data portal that's not dissimilar from data.gov. But I think if you're looking for data beyond New York City, pretty much every municipality has some sort of open data presence to varying degrees. But data.gov is the place to find a whole lot of it.
So I am helping an organization think about building out an open data initiative. And one of the questions that we're really trying to grapple with is how we think about trust building in the data that we put out there. And I'm curious from y'all's perspective, as you're going to open data tools and thinking about the raw data or the sources that you're looking at, like how you think about ensuring accuracy, validity, and anticipating questions that people might ask of you about that data?
I mean, I would say it depends on the agency and the caveats that they disclose around their data. Generally, an agency that posts a detailed data dictionary and really explains what went into their data collection process is going to be a data set that I feel more comfortable with and feel I can use in a way that's going to be reliable. If there's not a lot of documentation, that just necessitates going back to the agency and asking a lot of questions and really understanding what the caveats and limitation around their data is. I know there are certain data sets that are incomplete, especially around COVID-19 pandemic times. There's all sorts of strains on different government systems that would perhaps prevent a full accounting of whatever the data source might be, whether that is something around collecting accurate data on who has a case of COVID-19 or that ambulance data, maybe that's not being collected fully or something because there's just not enough capacity in the system to accurately log everything. Ambulance data is not a great example because I think that is fairly comprehensive data. But again, I think, yeah, you do have to read the documentation and follow up and make sure that what you're looking at, that you fully understand the processes around it and that you can trust it.
As reporters, I know we all try to explain fully parameters and be really open and transparent about this is the data, this is who it's from, these are the limitations. You know, that initial vaccination data about demographic, like I think a large percentage, I forget off the top of my head, did not say what their ethnicity was. So you're sort of presenting data that you know isn't perfect, but there was such an appetite for it that, and trust me, I mean, I got plenty of emails from people saying that I shouldn't have published it, right? But this is what we have so far. This is what the city and the state data shows. This is what it is. You know, I think being really open with readers, what it is, and then from there, especially something like COVID that is moving so quickly, I think we reached a point where we want information out, not wrong information, but maybe if it's not complete, we can at least be open about what's missing.
And I would say, I think there's a great level of healthy skepticism from the public, at least the public that reads some of our work. Folks have come back to us to ask questions about the data that we publish around COVID-19 and to ask, are we talking about residents of New York City or non-residents? Are we including nursing home deaths? Are we including confirmed deaths or probable deaths, that sort of thing? It depends on the reader, their level of proficiency and understanding. But I think folks are willing to engage with the data and not take things at face value. And we can provide a service by being that interface, explaining the complexities around data. Question from Brian, that's how often would you say you find ideas starting from the data versus validating a hunch or leading or a lead looking at the data second? As I was preparing my part of this, I was thinking about that actually. And I think a lot of the times it does start with a hunch or a observation that you want to validate and inspect. I've always found it hard to start with a giant data set and ask a novel question that no one else has asked before and then find something that no one else has found before. Very often when you start with a question that doesn't come from an observation, I think you find your assumption to be false or you find that there might not be anything interesting there. It's always worthwhile to do that work, and especially when there's a new data set that's been released that no one has looked at before, it's worth doing that. But very often, especially with City Open Data, I think we are trying to get to the facts behind an observation or just see what the process is behind something. In the case of those facade reports, the inspection reports, that was prompted by a news event, but we were really exploring the system for the first time there. So that is an example of maybe something where we were looking at the data without any expectations, but I would say it leans more heavily towards the backing up the shoe level reporting and what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, there have been, especially pre-COVID when news felt a little slower, there were plenty of Monday mornings where I'm thinking, oh, I have to write stories this week and I don't have anything, where I would go to the Open Data website and then shuffle by recently updated or added, hoping that there was going to be a data set in here that's it. This is my story. And unfortunately for me, it rarely works out that way because I think, yeah, having the reporting done, or at least a tip or an idea or something like I said, wow, there's a lot of graffiti. I wonder if there's more complaints. I think that seems like the better way. But because there's so much data, I sometimes want, when you're just grasping at pitching stories, it's like, there's got to be something here. But like Will says, it's better to kind of go into it organically and then find that data that can back it up.
And there are some data sets that I think lend themselves towards reviewing, like payroll data is something where you can always find extremes that are probably worth looking into, and data sets that are worth checking up on periodically to find those kinds of situations for sure.
Yeah, I wish they could, Brian. I wish we can get alerted. I think there are like visual ping and websites like that, but yes, unfortunately, I'm sure in 5 years there'll be an AI robot to find the stories for us, and then we'll all be just kidding.
Yeah, I'm happy to call it there. What do you guys think? Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah. I'm easy to find if anyone ever wants to reach out. So thank you, Zachary, and thank you everyone for tuning in.
Have a great weekend, y'all. Thanks. Bye.